Welcome to Movies Your Life. My name is Nathan Chandler, and I am privileged to have my wife, Whitney, joining us today for the podcast.
Hi. It's been a long time since I've been invited back. I don't know what I did the last time.
You offended a lot of people, I'm sure.
I'm sure.
Do you smell that, Whitney?
What is it?
It smells like college football season to me. What about you?
Yeah, it's hot. No, I love college football. I can't wait.
Yeah. Well, before we talk about the films that we're going to discuss today, I usually say this to the end of the podcast, but I thought it'd be good to talk about it in the front end. But basically, I need all our listeners' help. You may be listening to this podcast through Spotify or Apple Podcasts. I've even talked to some friends that do it through Google. But if you do have a Spotify account, it would really help us out if you just jumped on Spotify, found our podcast, hit follow, listen to a few episodes. Basically, I produce this podcast using Spotify for podcasters. And when you get to a certain level, you qualify for ambassador ads. And we are right on the cusp of going over that boundary. So to all those listening on Spotify, awesome. Thank you so much. But if you are on Apple or something else, if you don't mind doing that for us, we really appreciate it.
Yeah, and if you're the person that takes us over the limit and you live in Oklahoma, in Norman, I will buy you a Sonic drink.
I thought you were going to say you were going to cook for them or something.
Nah, they don't want that.
Yeah, we want people to do it,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Also, I wanted to thank everybody who participated in our social media polls about what film we should cover next. For next week's episode, we're halfway through the 50 best rom-coms list, and we polled our listeners like, what's a film we should watch that's not on the list? And Whitney must have paid people with Sonic drinks or something, because the people have spoken and they chose one of your favorite films.
Yep, my favorite movie.
So
we're gonna get the guns.
So we'll be talking about The American President next week. But for the time being, we thought of it, as I mentioned at the top of this podcast, with Labor Day weekends approaching, which usually means hopefully cooler temperatures are around the corner, but it is the start of college football season, even though technically there were some games last weekend. But this is just when our TV watching habits definitely change. And so recently we have watched the Netflix series Untold, and it's a series of sports documentary films. And we watched two of them, so we thought it'd be a lot of fun to kind of cover these, because we talked to a lot of our friends who had watched them, and we were definitely watching college football when these two subjects were taking place. But I was kind of thinking of which one to cover first, but let's jump into Untold Swamp Kings, which we actually just... First, okay. Yes.
College football in the South is way bigger than professional sports.
When you come to Florida, football is the world here.
Everything is win or loser.
Anything less than winning a national title, you're a failure.
1, 2, 3, showdown!
This Untold series, it started in 2021, and documentaries as a whole have been on the rise of popularity, especially true crime documentaries. I've always been a fan of sports documentaries. I've always loved the ESPN 30 for 30 series, if anybody's ever watched those. And Netflix is definitely trying to kind of take their glory a little bit with this Untold series. So technically they're in about volume 3 right now. I haven't seen all of them. I did watch the very first one that came out, Untold Malice at the Palace, which was about the brawl between the Pacers and I think the Detroit Pistons. That really changed the way fan interaction happened, especially at NBA games. And I watched one, I believe it was last year, but it was Untold, the Girlfriend Who Didn't Exist, about Monte Teo and his essential, basically he got catfished. Netflix did a really good job with releasing these, kind of building up anticipation to college football season. So this first one is a little different, because the rest of the ones that I've seen have been kind of true movies. this Untold Swamp Kings is actually considered more of a docu-series, and it's 4 episodes. They're about 45 minutes each, but it basically just centers on the Florida Gators teams between 2010, specifically under the ruthless football coach Urban Meyer, and really especially centers on the team when Tim Tebow makes his appearance on the team.
But it wasn't as much about Tim Tebow as I thought the whole thing was going to be about him.
Right.
When I went into it,
Yeah. So it does give a kind of a scope of this. So just kind of right out the gate, like, did you enjoy the series? Did you like this series?
I did. I had a lot of bias because I don't love the Florida Gators. Aren't like one of my hated teams. They were in 2005 to 2010. But they aren't like right now one of my like hated teams. So like going into it, I didn't really think it would conjure up a lot of thoughts. But as a Sooner fan, I had a hard time watching some of it, and it would just like agitate me still to this day. And I have such a distaste for Tim Tebow and the parts I do not like about Tim Tebow. I thought the documentary would cover, not because I thought they would put him in a bad light, but as much as the news and sports and everybody praised him, I thought they would praise him like that, and it really wasn't about him. And so it kind of almost agitated me that it didn't do that as much as I thought they would at least cover why they did that so much, and they didn't really do that. So I was kind of taken aback because they kind of disarmed me because they just didn't really cover him like I thought they would cover him.
Right, yeah.
They covered all of the stars pretty equally.
Yeah, they really did.
Thought.
Yeah, and the last episode, they kind of hit a little bit on the Tim Tebow factor.
Yeah.
And kind of as a team, how it was a little hard, not because of his attitude towards them, but more so the media attention and the way the public kind of received them. So they do touch on it a little end, but this, I did like this documentary a lot just because I thought it did a pretty good job, like as you mentioned, kind of hitting every piece of the pie, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think that I had some friends that are now OU fans because they live here, but they were not OU fans in 2005 to 2010. And so when we were talking about watching this Swamp Kings, I immediately was like a true Oklahoma Norman OU fan and said, "Ugh, I hate Tim Tebow." And their faces looked at me like I was the worst human being on the planet. And watching the documentary, and in their mind's eye, I can understand how they thought he was a stand-up kind guy, because that's also what the documentary showed. Now, watching in 2005 to 2010, watching his fake grossness, and watching how the media really played up his behavior. Now, I don't know if that's his fault or not. Maybe he is truly just the nicest human being on the planet. But in 2005 to 2010, as much as the media spotlighted him like this saint of all saints, like he was Jesus here on earth, made me despise him. And so those people looked at me like I was a horrible human being. And they were like, "What? You don't like Tim Tebow?" And I was like, "Nobody in Norman likes Tim Tebow." And even my mom the other day, we were like, "You should go watch Swamp Kings." And she was like, "Ugh, I hate Tim Tebow." Said the exact same thing I did. And then I was telling somebody else in Norman at lunch, a work friend, and they were like, "Oh, Tim Tebow." And I was like, I wish you'd been there when I was telling these people that. But watching this show, that is not how he is portrayed. He was portrayed still as this nice stand-up guy, and maybe he is. But in my world, where he beat the Sooners in the national championship, I'd like to continue to think of him as Tim Tebow.
Yeah, and whether it's college football or other NFL programs, or whatever, it's always easy to create a storyline, and but I think it's best, especially in college football, and we'll talk a little bit with Johnny football. They like to latch on to a player. I mean, Heisman talk like begins like right at the very beginning,
Yeah.
And who's going to win the Heisman, and there's so many factors in such a long season. So yeah, I actually so what Whitney's alluding to, and it happens in the 4th episode, but the Florida Gators were going for their second national championship, third of all time, but in this era, and in 2008 they played Sam Bradford's Oklahoma Sooners, and it was as if Whitney was just watching the game all over again. They were showing plays that had happened, and Whitney's like, "Why didn't they call this? Why didn't they?" A total homer.
It wasn't a catch. After I rewatched it on the footage, even the guy said, "I don't think I caught it," and I was like, "You didn't." Anyway,
I was like, I just felt like almost the disgust from Whitney right next to me, and I'm like, this happened, Okay, so over 10 years ago.
15 years ago.
Yeah, 15 years ago. But, I mean, she was just right there. But we do have to say, and sorry, some of this, our Sooner fandom's coming out on this. We vividly remember watching this game together because we were engaged at the time. And we watched this with Whitney's cousin, Bo, and his wife, Stacy. Hi, Bo and Stacy. And we just remember it was a tight game towards the end. And, I mean, when basically it looked like Florida basically had it, they were going to run the clock out. I mean, the announcers just started laying heavy.
They were laying heavy even when OU was ahead.
Yeah. But specifically, we remember, and of course they didn't show it in this documentary, but Tebow started talking trash to the Sooners and got in people's faces. And these days, I think they would easily throw the yellow flag. And I specifically remember the announcer starting to go, "Oh, well, he's just passionate about the game. He just got..." And anyway, we were just like that. For a second, you kind of saw the other side of him.
All the while he was kneeling, and while I also pray and like Christians, that is not what this is about. He is a poser. Constantly, he's down on the field. On the middle of the game, do you think he's down there in his pads and everything reading the Bible? No. But do you know who he is? You know what they're showing him doing on the sidelines in the middle of the 3rd quarter? Praying. Is that true? No, he's not. Maybe he's reading a playbook. I don't know, but they're acting like he's doing his Bible study lesson in the middle of the 3rd quarter, and then he runs off and he screams cuss words and obscenities in our poor OU football players' faces that are sweet and innocent. They did nothing wrong.
Hey,
but that documentary does not go into that, so.
Yeah, and there's a lot of language that you hear in this thing in the back.
And he did scream and yell at his players in the weight room.
Yeah, but he didn't cuss at them.
But he did scream and yell. I mean, he wasn't a saint of all saints. He acted just like every other football player in the locker room. Yeah. I mean, it's fine. I actually kind of liked him better. Once he was like a normal human being. But that's not what the news did to him. And maybe that was the news's fault. I don't know. Maybe he is a nice guy. I have a lot of other thoughts about him on the documentary. But that is not what this is all about. I want to quickly say, I think I'm going to segue you to this, but the whole documentary is about basically how hard they trained. I mean, that's a big portion of it.
Yeah.
And I have never seen... I don't think that the Sooners train like that. So, I don't... Maybe they do. Yeah. Maybe I'm being fooled, but that was a lot.
Yes.
So if you played football, tell us, is that how they train?
Yeah, because early on, and I kind of teased it talking about how, Urban Meyer has this legendary, he was ruthless. And I mean, and even some of his players at the time were just kind of like, hey, we're not going to war. And these guys love football. They eat, breathe, sleep football. And I mean, I was even pretty shocked by, some of these like wrestling matches and stuff. It kind of seemed
they would practice like midnight to 3 a.m.
Oh yeah.
Instead of like, it was crazy. Yeah. Like it was crazy. Yeah. Maybe they do that.
I saw a meme or something and it said, when you were out partying on Friday nights, this is what the Florida Gators were doing. And I mean, people puking all over the place, and
I mean, maybe that's just what they all do.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, but
it was crazy.
We kind of just for a second go back to Tim Tebow a little bit. I have to. We kind of before hitting record, we kind of joked about that we should do this whole podcast in a Tim Tebow voice.
What do you mean? Why would you say that?
So we watched this Netflix documentary. And
he was so soft-spoken and serious.
And I mean,
I mean, like, why would you talk like that? You could probably, you have to turn the volume up on our podcast right now.
I'm just so earnest, and
I'm so
love
kind
football.
and sweet. I would never yell at anybody.
It was the best years of my life.
I mean, why does he talk like that? Like, he literally talked like he was filming it in a library. Like, it never quit. I mean, it was 4 episodes, and every episode he's talking like this.
Yeah.
Unless he's in the weight room, and then he's like, "Rah!" But why does he talk like that? It is the strangest thing I've ever heard.
Yeah.
Somebody tell me it's not.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about Urban Meyer a little bit, because this is definitely, I have not been a fan of his for a long time. I do want you to tell a little story of why I felt bad, because I never liked Urban Meyer, mainly because of this Florida team, but I never liked. Now, I will say a lot more has been exposed now of mental health issues. I mean, he says in this documentary that he was dealing with depression, and I don't think that forgives him of some of his actions. But anyway, it always felt like he was kind of like, I'm leaving football to be more with my family. Then he's not with his family, and then he totally squandered the season he was with the Jacksonville Jaguars. But I thought it'd be kind of nice. I remember one time I was around your dad, and I just started bad-mouthing Urban Meyer, and I think this was when he was with Ohio State. And then it's really conflicting in my head, because I'll let you tell the story.
My dad loved Urban Meyer because he had, when he worked in Utah.
He started in Utah.
In Utah, the assistant coach, it wasn't necessarily him, but the assistant coach, and I don't know his name, but he let my cousin Jay, who was an amazing guy who loved Utah football, but he had Down syndrome, and he let him work for the team, water boy, towel boy, all around, just an extra player on the team. And that assistant coach just took him in and let him be on the sidelines, let him do all sorts of stuff for Utah. And Urban Meyer let him as well, and played a role in that. And so my dad just instantly loved everything about Urban Meyer for that reason. And Nathan was always like, but he's a terrible human being. And I think it took, I don't know, I haven't heard what my dad will have to say about this documentary, but I think it'll be hard for him to be like, oh yeah, I see it.
Yeah. Well, it is very interesting, because he wants to win, but even, it seems just to the detriment of the health of other players, that sort of thing. There does seem to be a turning point, but almost where winning becomes a sickness, and he couldn't even enjoy. He talks about when they win this national championship, and even before he went back to the locker room to celebrate with his team, he was calling recruits, like not being able to. And so I think this documentary is an interesting portrait of that. Now, he doesn't. He doesn't, I guess, apologize for a whole lot of stuff, but I don't know if he necessarily has to.
I kind of figure, from watching the documentary, because it is slanted towards the Florida Gators, and he is in it, so it's slanted towards him too.
Yes.
But I feel like he probably acts just like any other head football coach.
Yeah.
I mean, I to be honest, I didn't think that he was, he's tough on them and relentless and gross, and you don't really want to be around him. And probably as his family, he probably wasn't around, because his focus was always on football. But I would imagine most head football coaches, especially of a big conference like SEC, would be like that.
Yeah. Yes. And watching this, I really was enjoying it the first episode. Kind of by the 4th episode, I think, if you're a college football fan, you'll definitely love this documentary. I don't think there's much to not like about it.
Yeah, and if you like Tebow, you might just need to get out your hearing aids so that you can hear him.
If you need a calming voice, just to make you feel
Tim
better
Tebow.
about yourself. But after 4 episodes and after all the arc, there is a little bit kind of, it just made me start thinking about certain sports documentaries. And we'll talk maybe a little bit about this, about Johnny Football, but it almost felt like this is more of an autobiography of the Florida Gators, from the kind of the mouth of the Florida Gators, versus, here's a filmmaker that's going and exploring all these facets.
Yeah, if they had come to Norman to interview people like me or Sooners, they would have been like a whole other side, or even showed some of the media surrounding him at that time.
Yeah.
I think that would have really changed the face of it. Again, it was interesting,
Yes.
but it did. I agree with you. It's more just like kind of their story, and I learned a lot from their mouths, from their voices, and in a positive light towards all of them.
Yes.
I mean, nothing that was really. I mean, they would even sometimes say like, "Yeah, we took it too far" or whatever, but I mean, it was still slanted towards them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And I'm not enough of a college football purist to know, or historian to be like, these were the greatest teams of all time. I honestly had never really considered Florida in that range. Now it is impressive, 2 championships in 3 years. I'm not saying that, but a lot of the games that they even showcase, they showed, and it was things I remember. I mean, they would have complete meltdowns. They would have all these turnovers. So the documentary is kind of built up of like, this is one of the greatest teams ever. But then they're barely squeaking out a lot of the wins. Now, they did become pretty dominant at a certain point. But I did think that was a little interesting. I'd be interested in people who really, really follow college football, like where this Florida Gators team actually stacks up to. I'm not saying the Sooners just because of the Sooners, but the Sooners, Alabama,
Yeah.
or even when Texas won the championship with Vince Young.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean, this was just their story.
Yes,
Yeah,
it was
that
just
was it.
it was just their story. You know, there's a lot of things they didn't touch on as far as the fact that Aaron Hernandez was on the team, who later murdered, you know, some people.
Yeah.
You know, there was a lot of stuff that was kind of brushed to the side, but still, I mean, I thought pretty fascinating to get an inside look to a college football program. Even it started making you think of like, oh, I wonder what Venerables is doing with all these guys and stuff like that. So before we move on to the next one, I did want to talk real quick that one of the former tight ends who's featured in this, Tate Casey, I did not know him personally, but his family was in Longview, and I graduated with his brother, so it was kind of fun. It was kind of fun to see somebody that I knew, but he would have no idea who I was. So, okay, well, we'll segue to another SEC team and talk about Untold, Johnny Football.
He's taken on Rolling Stones Beatles status.
Manziel Madness has spawned the nickname Johnny Football.
Johnny Football.
Johnny Football. Johnny Football.
When I got everything that I wanted, I think I was the most empty that I've ever felt inside.
This documentary traces the just rise of this freshman that seemed to come out of nowhere, Johnny Manziel. And so he spent 2 years at Texas A&M, and it's kind of to me, a Icarus story, you know, a guy who flies too close to the sun. So only plays 2 years at A&M, but won the Heisman as a freshman, the only freshman to do so. And really, what'd you think? What'd you think about this portrayal of Johnny Manziel?
Well, so you know, I feel like I follow college football pretty closely, and so, but I don't remember things like you do. Like, so later, what year was that? 2000 and
2012, 2013,
so 10 years ago. Like, so me, just if you would have come up to me before this documentary and said Johnny Manziel, I would have been like, oh yeah, he was really good. He played at A&M. That would have been my like story about him. Like, oh yeah, he was really wild and fun, right? Like, meaning he, in my mind, he just played wild and fun football. I don't remember the whole story. So I'm not an A&M fan. I'm not somebody that followed him. So watching it was fascinating because that is not how I remembered it. Like, I just remembered he won. I mean, I couldn't have even told you if he won the Heisman. I just knew he did really well. Like, that's all I would have conjured up. But watching this story, it is crazy. It's fascinating. You should definitely go watch it. But I just, like, there's a lot of thoughts, and I'm sure we'll get to them. But, like, he just wasn't controlled by anybody. And he was taught at a young, and his parents are it's so interesting because they had zero control over his life. I mean, he literally ruled the roost in high school. He ruled the roost in college, and it just backfired on him, is what it looked like to me.
Yeah. But it also exposes, you know, a system. I mean, I don't think he necessarily should have done all the things that he did, but, you know, it's like he realized, especially, it's really interesting because it really is like, you know, all this great talent squandered. And it's like he knew he had the talent, he probably would say he didn't really love football, but he knew he had the talent. So he was like, I'm just gonna get everything I can out of this while I can.
Well, he didn't even seem like a kid that like trained. It wasn't like, it's literally like in high school, he just was good and he was a risk taker that gave zero cares.
Yeah.
And so he would go out and just wildly throw the ball and it worked for him.
Yeah.
And he was in a Texas town where football is king and therefore he was king and he could do no wrong. And you could tell that. He never got in trouble in high school. So when he went to A&M, but it appeared his coaches had zero control. I think if he would have gone out and gotten in trouble like he did, you would be benched or set the next day game. But because he was so good, there was zero way they were going to bench him. You know?
And it's an interesting look, especially his first year is the first year A&M was in the SEC, which is like as Sooner fans, we're about to experience this next year. It'll be interesting to see that transition. But I wasn't quite aware. We had I remember this time because we had a good friend who graduated from A&M, so I remember her talking a lot about Johnny football, but we just didn't watch many A&M games. And this documentary is interesting just in kind of talking about like just the timing of his talent, and also in the inaugural year of A&M being in the SEC, and just how much money came from from that partnership.
Well, and I'm just going to take you right into it, but he got all this money and he was paid to do stuff that he wasn't supposed to be doing. And that was part of his big problem. But now, you get into this NIL stuff and that is kind of setting up that he was basically like, I should be getting the money for these things. Mm-hmm. And so you can't almost fault him because nowadays people are getting the money. But when he did it, he was doing something illegal and making the school get in trouble. And so that part is kind of weird to watch in light of knowing how much money you can get now.
Yeah.
And he just basically would cover it up and it's just crazy. And he had this best friend. Hopefully you guys have all seen this if you're listening to this podcast. We didn't give a spoiler alert. Maybe we should.
But he has a buddy. His name's Nate Finch.
Yeah. And it was like, they, in the way their stories unfolded, they both cared so deeply about each other and their friendship. I really could not believe that it was over. But, he just, had him kind of as his manager, as his go-to person, and let him take the fall for him. And then he's just gone missing and they're not even friends anymore. It's just terrible.
Yeah. And once again, that's kind of, we talked about this with Swamp Kings. This kind of more almost like this is a autobiography take on Johnny Manziel, even though both documentaries aren't afraid to show they show not the great sides of things.
Yeah. But Johnny's is more, it's got it has his manager. It has that guy, but it also has his the new manager, and that guy's no longer with him. They called in some other people. It had his parents.
Yeah.
It had all sides of his story more.
But this one, I feel like, wherein the Swamp Kings, I feel like there were some storylines that just weren't talked about, but they were covering a lot. I still think Swamp Kings was really complete. I will say this Johnny Manziel one, after it was over, I was like, oh, there's a story there. It left a lot where I was like, oh, I really wanted to know more. This falling out with his buddy Nate, and but it does also. They once again kind of talk about the mental health, and he even mentions that he got diagnosed as being bipolar, and that probably explains a lot of stuff. But they, and I think he's very raw, and I think it's a big thing for him to show this side of him. But I kind of wanted to know a little bit more. The movie wraps up really fast.
Yeah, it could have been a 3 more series like the other ones. It had way more information.
Yeah.
I do feel like he's gone back and he's tried to make amends with some of his life, but he still says stuff like, yeah, I was young, I had the world in my own, I like to have fun, and he didn't act like he cared one bit. And some of the stuff he said was just so revealing. He did so terrible in the NFL, and he's like, why didn't they kept saying how much game tape did he watch, and he watched zero amounts of game tape. He just never practiced, never cared, never fine-tuned the craft, and that's just not something you see normally.
Yeah. I was listening to something where they were talking about this documentary, and they said some people kind of came out to kind of say, hey, now he was a complete bust with the Cleveland Browns, but he had some highlights from the season also. Like, like there were some high points, definitely more low points, but it is kind of interesting, the NFL is like this beast. And to me, there's part of me that kind of almost admires, like, he knew he wasn't in this for the long haul. And the fact that he, kind of in a way rips millions of dollars. He just was kind of like, get what I can get right now. And, now the NFL has certainly not shown that love towards its players like in the same way. So I do think it's a little funny. It's like, yeah, he should have shown us these years and stuff. And it's like, well, it's almost like you're the team that got duped into like, he's doing workouts with like.
But like if he was getting all that money, which is part of his problem, and we go into the NIL, and I am torn. I get it. You should be paid for your like work that they're having to do. But the amount of money that is changing hands is making these players the way that they are, and they can't get any more money. Like, it's just wild. Like that documentary right there, like he was having to sneak around, and that is why he got in trouble, and maybe he shouldn't have with the new rules in place. But it's like they're not teaching them how to manage those funds and how to manage their expectation of it. It's just kind of a weird dynamic. I think it needs a tighter look. Like it's like it swung from this side all the way to the other side, and it needs to meet in the middle a little bit. I'm not pro or con. There's just pros and cons on both sides. Yeah,
but I enjoyed Johnny Football, this documentary, way more than I expected to. Just I just think it's an amazing, interesting look, kind of a cautionary tale of really it seems like A&M kind of, there's really no winners or losers, but they're the ones who ultimately got to build the new stadium, got to do these things.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, even if you take yourself apart from Johnny Manziel, the man himself. I think it's an interesting look of the system and just how, both of these documentaries, you probably thought this, we talked about the intense workouts that the Gators were doing. It wasn't so, it was the intense workouts, but it's keeping in mind that these guys are so young. Like and not just these guys, all
college
collegiate athletes, and the fact that we just like, it's like we rip the youth from them, and anytime there's money involved, like there's.
But he didn't care. The difference between the two is like the other was like team, we're going to build this and build that, and that's what it's showing us. But he could have cared less about anybody. Down to, he didn't even care about his best friend.
Yeah.
He only cared, or his parents, or his team, or anything. He literally only cared about himself. And he is like I left 10 years ago thinking, oh, he's a fun football guy. He won the Heisman. To now,
he does the money sign. He does the money sign.
To like now, where I'm like, ooh, he is gross. He is the epitome of like that football jock that gets whatever he wants and does terrible things to other people and does not care.
Yeah.
And has no consequences for his actions. And I'm surprised. He probably got money for doing the documentary, but it did not paint him in a favorable light.
No. So. And there's a lot with documentaries as far as like, who comes on and does interviews and this type of thing. We could go probably on and on about Cliff Kingsbury, just how I feel about that guy. But like, basically, if you have Cliff Kingsbury as the representative of talking about Johnny Football's story and nobody else, it kind of clues you in. There, from what my memory is, there's not many former players that are talking about him. So it's really interesting when you kind of take a step back and like, oh yeah, like, where are the better? Yeah, it's sad in a lot of ways. And just a really interesting look. So we both highly recommend.
Go watch them. And I've seen a lot of people that have watched it. So go watch them.
Yeah, definitely a good primer to the football season coming up and get you excited about that. We would love to hear your feedback, especially I'm sure we have lots of Aggie friends. I would love to hear from them.
And I'm sure, unless you're a Sooner fan, I'm going to get eaten alive for my bashing of Tim Tebow because he is God's gift to football. God luckily blessed him with a talent, and luckily he can share the story to everybody because he is God's gift to football. I can't stand that guy.
Yeah. Personally, I don't know any Florida Gator fans, but I would love to hear the feedback from them on this. So, but as always, check out moviesaurelife.com for episodes, reviews, and more. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, give us a follow. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, go sign up for Spotify.
Go sign up for Spotify. Come back with us next week.
If you didn't watch, just go listen to the episode when he talks and you'll hear it.
Join us next week as we talk about the American president.
Yeah, we're going to get the guns.
All right.